Dr. Nathan Bray's Season 5 of Education for Love and Wisdom.
I'm thrilled to hear those words, Dr. Jeff Hittenberger, and it has been an awesome journey with you on this path of this podcast. I remember when we were first talking about this and brainstorming, how would we do this? What would we focus on? What would be our message? I think it's amazing that we've come to this moment, and I'm really impressed with the body of content that we have so far in this podcast. This season is going to be extra special, I know. So can you share a little bit about what this one's all about?
Yeah, first of all, you've been such an incredible partner. This would not have happened without both your insights and your technical expertise, which is going to make it possible this year to do both video and audio. So this year we'll have not only listeners, but also viewers. So this community continues to grow of Education for Love and Wisdom. And this season, we're focusing on a topic that I know means a lot to both of us. And that is, how do we make our schools and our worship communities more inclusive of all of our community members? It'll be based on a book we're currently putting together called Love, Wisdom, and Belonging in Schools and Faith Communities. And the subtitle of the book is Embracing and Empowering Children, Young People, and Adults with Disabilities. And we'll be interviewing authors of various chapters of that book and really going deep on something that is a vitally important issue.
I'm really excited about all this. And yes, this does matter to us, our faith communities, what the work we're doing with students in the classroom, of course. And for us, working with future educators, so important for them to be considering this in their work that they do in becoming teachers and professionals in education. How about this episode? Can you give us a little taste of what this is going to be about?
I'm really excited about this first episode. We get a chance to interview two of the authors of the book, including my co-editor, who is Dr. Joanne Van Boxtel. She is also the faculty director of our special education program, just an amazing person. And then the other person we'll be interviewing is Dr. Rodney Hume-Dawson. Rodney is a professor at Cal Poly Pomona, and he is an author of one of the chapters in the book. And the topic we'll be tackling is a big one, and that is theology and disability. That is, what's God's perspective on disability? And it's a deep subject.
Sure.
I think it's going to be a really exciting conversation, and that'll be episode 1 for this season.
So excited to have our first video episode. I was here for the conversation, and I think our listeners and our viewers are going to love this content and the wonderful insights that come out.
Thanks, Nathan. Let's go.
All right.
Well, I am so delighted to welcome you, Dr. Rodney Hume-Dawson, and you, Dr. Joanne Van Boxtel, to the Education for Love and Wisdom podcast. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time, and we're just so happy you're here.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Jeff, for inviting me to this phenomenal program. You know, I am elated, and like you, I'm looking forward to an extraordinary time.
Well, I know that you guys are really good friends. And part of the reason we're having you on together is because I know you have a friendship that goes back. Well, could you start by telling us just a little bit about how that friendship started?
Well, we actually met in our doctoral studies program at Chapman University. Both of us were pursuing a doctorate in education with an emphasis in disability studies. And I was in a cohort ahead of Rodney, but we would pass each other in the halls. Kind of, our cohorts were small, so we got to know each other across our cohorts. And then we both ended up at another institution, Cal Poly Pomona, continued connecting there. And I think we've just, as we've gotten to know each other over time, our friendship has just deepened and, made connections and professionally and personally as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joanne, for starting us off. I want to start by actually acknowledging, Joanne, for being the phenomenal woman that she is. When we talk about being a scholar practitioner, Joanne really embodies that. She is a long-time special educator, as you know. And it's almost as if, when we met at Chapman, we both clicked, right? I mean, she was always, this wonderful person that was respectable and honorable and would wave to me, when she sees me around, and I will do the same. And so that started building the bond. But one of the things I appreciate about her, we have this concept which she talked about in the last program where you invited her, nothing about us without us, right? And Joanne really embodies that in her scholarly work and in her practitioner work. And she's always seen me as someone, because of my impairment, right? She knows that I'm not just coming from a theoretical perspective, right? I'm both theory and practical, because I'm living, a living example of someone with a disability. And so, she's been like a guardian angel in so many ways. I always say that, very, very reminiscent of my mom, always looking out for me wherever we've been together, whether we're at a conference or at Cal Poly, where she always advocated for me to ensure that, I have an opportunity to teach courses and those kinds of things. So publicly, let me thank you for just the woman that you are and being such a remarkable friend.
Well, my respect for you goes so deep in my heart. I have respected you since the minute I met you. I think you have so much to offer with your experience as someone who lives with disability, but also your profound theological and philosophical understandings of disability. So I'm always in awe of your work and just your presence. You have such a warmth about you too. So
thank you, Joanne.
Bless you.
I think it's a mutual.
We love that.
Mutual
we love
feeling.
That. And we feel so blessed to have Joanne here as the leader of our special ed program. And it was Joanne who introduced us to you as we planned our disability symposium last year. She's like, I have the perfect guy. Yes. And so we invited you to be one of our keynote panelists. And what you shared was so profound and so rich. And the topic of our discussion today and of the chapter in the book, Love, Wisdom, and Belonging, that Joanne and I are taking the lead on writing, is God's perspective of disability.
Yeah.
And
I love it.
And it's a topic that you've written on. We've benefited so much from what you have written and shared about this topic. And for that reason, we thought, wouldn't it be great if we could have Rodney kind of be a guide to this topic and share the wisdoms you've accumulated over the years. So with that in mind, I would love we go back kind of to your origin story. So you guys meet at Chapman in your doctoral program, but that was a long way physically from where your story begins. Would you mind just sharing a little bit about your origin story?
Absolutely. And let me also use the occasion to publicly thank, my parents, my relatives, my extended family, of which you all are now part of. I definitely would not be here today without all of those people's love and affection and advocacy and generosity. My story started in Sierra Leone, in Freetown, a small capital city. Sierra Leone is a small, very small country near the ocean in West Africa. And I, at the age of 18 months, I was diagnosed with poliomyelitis, right? My mother, she died very young too. I wish, she were here today so that both of us could, share a lot in our experiences and all of those things. But from what I recall, she mentioned that, I had started walking, basically taking some steps. And when polio hit, with fever and all that good stuff that usually happens to polio survivors. And then all of a sudden, one morning, she wanted to take me somewhere, but then I couldn't stand,
Mm.
And so she got very concerned. And anyway, I was taken to the hospital, and then they diagnosed me with polio. But I see a hand of God in my story in so many ways, because there were so many instances. I will give you at least 4, right? After the polio diagnosis, the doctors had agreed that I would require surgery. And they also found out that I had a dislocated hip in addition to the poliomyelitis. And so they wanted to do the surgery basically for the dislocation. But the very first time, we had challenges with electrical power. So there was no light and they couldn't do it. Then we went again the second time, and then the anesthesiologist was not available. Then a third time, the doctor that was I think he was the only orthopedic surgeon in that hospital, who was very brilliant, really, really brilliant, but he was an alcoholic. And so he had his own issues, and that particular third time he was drunk, and so couldn't do the surgery. And then the fourth time, everything seemed to align, and then he came in, and then he had some doubts, right? Many years later, I was then a college student. I had this conversation with him because I went to visit him and said, "What happened there?" And then he said, that last time, the fourth time, he was just worried because, I was such a little kid. A hip dislocation surgery is really heavy, right? And that would have been very painful. And so he was concerned about the pain and all of those challenges. But when I come to think about it, I really think that God had a hand in my life, because what if, something else could have gone wrong? What if I could have lost my life at that point in time? Mm-hmm. So the fact that I'm alive, speaks to faith and that God definitely had some providential meaning of all of this. Another pivotal thing that happened, my mother was an exceptional woman of God, right? And I really owe her faith and all of that. And perhaps all of us, all of our children are very grounded in faith. I've got my older brother who is a priest. And I remember when I was very small, she would carry me in her arms. They carried me around all over when we were going out because I couldn't walk. And then at that time, I was not using braces and everything. But whenever she was home, she would carry me in her arms and read Bible stories to me. Mm. And for some reason, I just love that, hearing my mom's voice, reading those stories. And then she made sure she bought, those children's books of all the prophets and some of those heroic characters. You talk about Samson, or you talk about Abraham, or, all of those children's books. And those were some of the things that I played with. And I tell you, I really enjoyed that. So that is where my story started. And the third one that I really want to share, and I think is very essential to the work that we're doing here, which parents, wanted me to go to school like their other children. And then, a number of the schools rejected me and said no. They came up with all kinds of excuses, and they didn't have somebody to carry me around, what it would be like and all of that. But talk about a family's love story. and I think that's my love story. My parents got together. My mom, everybody she knew around town, she got them all involved. My grandparents, my uncles on my dad's side, to write letters and just advocate for me until I finally got in, and so I'm grateful for the opportunity, and when I think about this, I'm reminded, Anfinga is one of these cultural disability writers, and she was also very heavy in the disability rights movement here in the United States. She's written a number of books on polio because she herself was a polio survivor. She lives somewhere in San Francisco. And she talks about this concept that when you've had a challenge or any kind of disability, it impacts you and affects you, and shapes you in so many ways, right? And when I think of the way my polio experience has shaped me, on the one hand, you look at the idea of, even in my own embodiment, you've got my left and right leg. My left leg is very strong, or much stronger. Of course, the polio affected it as well. But my right leg is where the polio really, destroyed. And it's almost every time I'm walking, it just comes along for the ride, right? And so I think of it as, the medical condition obviously stays with you, and you're wondering, how society thinks about all of this. And then you also have the social aspect, where people see you because of your impairments. They think, just like what happened in my educational journey, you're not good enough or smart enough or capable enough, right? And so on the one hand, there is the medical condition, right, which you have to live with the pain and the daily challenges. On the other hand, you've got the social ramifications, right? And so it's definitely never an easy thing, right? If I come here and tell you that it's an easy thing, because mental illness is such a big challenge in the United States today, but there is a correlation between physical disability and mental disability, really. And that is the psychology of the disability itself. Everyone who has a disability has to deal with that psychological ramification, right? Of how you're treated by society and the challenges that you go through medically. And so all of that has shaped the person that I am. When I think about it, the big one for me is the fact that disability has really helped me to understand the social injustices in our world, right? And that the best thing that I could do, right, to help make a difference, not just for myself, but other people who come after me, right? And for all those young children, whether they are mentally disabled or physically disabled, is for me to be an advocate, is for me to fight, is for me to write, for me to teach, and to be able to make a difference. And so in that way, that's social injustice. And also, my disability has given me, right, my career, right? And I know people tend to always look at it from the negative perspective, but I enjoy this work so much because I'm actually studying myself, right? And so I never have a dull moment with this. And so that is the way disability has helped shape me.
Beautiful. Yeah. Well, this journey that you have been on, starting in Sierra Leone as an 18-month-old child, contracts polio and encounters resistance from your very earliest years in terms of schools being resistant to inclusion and so on. And then you have this community of advocacy around you. And ultimately you become this amazing advocate, PhD, college professor. Who were some of the advocates, You mentioned your mom and other family, but were there other advocates along the way in your schooling experience, in your church experience, who helped get you from there to here, who represented the kind of advocacy that then you took on as your life's calling and mission?
Yeah, I mean, I had quite a number of them, and I'm so thankful for them too. When I went to secondary school, I met a teacher. In fact, we were talking about this the other day, and he was teasing me. You know, as a young man, he was my English teacher in secondary school, but he was also an actor, and a very funny one. So, you know, I think as a child, you know, that got me attracted to him so much. You know, he had his own company, theater company, and he would stage plays and all those kinds of things. So he was telling me, I don't remember that, but he was telling me that when I was a student, I used to follow him around all over, and he would tell me, go to class. But really, Charlie Hafner really, I think, opened the door for me in so many ways, because I went to him, I think when I was in my second or third year, and said, you know, I want you to put me on the school play, right? And I would really love to perform. And of course, he had all kinds of negative people saying things to him that they were concerned that I would fall or something would happen and all of that. But he was also a very feisty person, so he got me there. And so I ended up becoming a narrator of the play. And it turned out, you know, and I was also a narrator that acted as an older person. And it worked perfectly because I'm using crutches, and then they dressed me up as an old man. So it was such a perfect example. And in the midst during that ceremony, because usually we would have a prize-giving ceremony, something like a graduation ceremony here in the United States, where, you know, people get prizes and we've got speeches. We, you know, give accolades to students and teachers that are doing exceptionally well. And there was, in the audience at that particular time, there was a gentleman there who had a son, you know, but also was one of the top people working for UNICEF. You know, the United Nations Children's Fund. You know, you have them all over Africa doing a lot of good work, advocacy, and all these kinds of things to help with developmental projects. And at that time, Sierra Leone was dealing with some serious challenges with vaccination issues. So they were looking for a child advocate, right? And then he went, you know, he knew my English teacher. So after the ceremony, he went to ask him, who is that young man? Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, he's got such a lovely attitude and spirit. And I think we should bring him on board. And so they brought me on board as a child and disability advocate, right? And I think that really transformed my life. Mm-hmm. Because at that point in time, I had no idea that, you know, the disability, you know, movement was such a huge thing, you know, happening, and there were disabled people gathering around the world, in Africa, in the United States, in Europe. And so they suggested to me that we should start, you know, an umbrella disabled group, right? Because you had all these different disabled organizations, but there was not one umbrella. They were struggling whenever they want to invite. They had to call all of these groups of people. And so you guys need to set up. And then they said to me, we want you to lead that. So now you're talking to a 15, 16-year-old, and I'm saying, oh my God, you know, how can I do this? You know, but then I saw it as a challenge. And then I was talking to somebody. I said, I don't know if I want to head the group, but maybe we could find somebody who could do this, who is much older, much more experienced. And then somebody suggested Dr. Eldred Jones, who was an English professor, was also a former president of the University of Sierra Leone. He had just retired, you know, that he was blind. You know, he would be a great person to head that organization. And so he came on board, and both of us worked together. And I'll tell you, you know, we started doing sensitization meetings and advocacy work. We ended up writing a constitution that is and that's something that resembles the ADA laws right here in the United States. You know, Americans with Disabilities Act, right? Mm-hmm. And eventually that was passed. You know, by the Sierra Leonean Parliament and all of that good stuff.
Wow. Yeah. So those early opportunities in educational settings, were they matched by opportunities within church settings? What was your experience of the church's response to you and to the idea of inclusion?
You know, that's always a great question, you know, that I sometimes really get to think about. My siblings, they were all part of the Sunday school at the church where my mom went to. But this was quite a little distance from where we lived, right? And I was not part of that group. I mean, my mother is not here to ask, you know, what the reason that was. You know, I mean, my parents obviously took me to church, but I was never part of that group. But it's something that I get to really think about. But in addition, there was also a church that was just up the road from where we lived. And I started going there occasionally whenever I did not accompany or follow my parents to the church in the capital city. And that church, you know, the pastor there and the senior warden and other leaders there, I think they were very progressive, because when I was maybe 6 or 7, they gave me wonderful opportunities to either lead, you know, services or read lessons. And I think that was actually what helped me too, to be able to stand in front of the public and gave me that kind of confidence, because the church, I think they had seen a gift that most other people had not seen, you know, and they recognized that and you know, they took it in a stride. And so I'm really grateful. So I would say, generally, I think the church was much more open, you know, to welcoming me and giving me opportunities, you know, to be involved in so many ways, you know, at least from my earliest recollections.
Very powerful. Yeah. Well, one of the things that, Joanne, I know you're working on is ways in which we might be able to help churches who, for one reason or another, are struggling to serve children and young people and adults with disabilities. And it seems like many churches would like to be more inclusive communities, but struggle to know how to do that. It's beautiful that you found, as a young person, a church that was proactive in seeing your gifts and embracing you. Joanne, could you just talk a little bit about how did this become a priority for you, this idea of helping churches become more inclusive communities?
Absolutely. I think actually a lot of it stemmed from my doctoral training. And one of the books that I review was by Debbie Beth Kramer, and it's called Disability and Christian Theology. And she presented this concept of the limits model, which is really, in a nutshell, that disability and differences should be an unsurprising aspect of the human condition. And in my life and in my, especially my professional life, I was very passionate about inclusive education, always thinking about opportunities in a classroom context for inclusion. And then the more I learned about disability, the disability rights movement, different models of understanding disability, just all this history around inclusion and disability. And here I am studying about disability and inclusion and how to be more inclusive in schools. And I was in my heart thinking, well, the church should be leading the way with this as, thinking about the kingdom of God and being inclusive and welcoming to all. And so I think that really stirred my curiosity and interest in trying to understand, just in my own personal experience, just more of an awareness of, wanting to see more individuals, adults, kids with disabilities as part of our worship. And I, for a bit, worked in the children's ministry at my church and thought about it in that context too. Just more of a awareness of the absence, I guess, of adults and kids with disabilities in church communities. So once I considered that model and just the fact that we think about what, Rodney, you talked about having a disability that's a little more visible. We talk about visible and invisible disabilities. But, with this limits model really argues that we all have limitations, whether or not people can see them, quote, see them or not. And so I think that the concept of this limits model really opened my eyes to, it kind of expanded my view of inclusion and inclusion in the church context. And it really motivated me to, I think stirred that initial motivation in me to really kind of apply some of the concepts I was learning in a school or educational setting to think about how can these work in a church context or a children's ministry context. How can we make curriculum more accessible for kids who may have more significant disabilities? How can we raise more awareness in our church and more awareness about the need for more families with kids with disabilities to be welcome in our church? And just started to think about ways to be more intentional, I guess would be the word, in outreach and in making our services, our ministries more inclusive and accessible.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And think about that, the church that Rodney attended as a young man, if they had not seen his gifts, think about how much they would have lost. Mm-hmm. And when we miss the gifts of our children and young people and adults with disabilities, we are impoverished by that loss, aren't we?
That is such a phenomenal concept. Absolutely. And even when you think about this in terms of society at large, when we ignore people with disabilities, we hide them, we disenfranchise them, and we do all the kinds of things that we do, it is such a big loss, right? Even if you think about a nation's development, right? And I think about Sierra Leone, right? Or a lot of the African countries, they're losing so much because there's a lot of disenfranchisement going on, until today, right? But I want to go back to the church issue, right? Joanne talked about limitations, right? Yes. I think even though those churches saw the gifts in me, they still have a lot of work to do because, to be honest, I didn't see a lot of other people with disabilities around, right? And then the other part, you're talking about making spaces accessible, making curriculum accessible, doing things that will kind of encourage or bring other families. There's still a lot of work to do when we think about that within churches. And then one of the things that you learn about, you think about churches that I think is the communion, right? That it is such a huge concept, right? In churches, that sharing that blood and wine and coming together in communion. A lot of people with disabilities feel that they are left out when it comes to that because there are no ramps within churches. Often the altars are very high where they will need to go get the bread or the wine. So helping to make those kinds of spaces accessible, because after all, Christ talked about coming together.
Yes.
And people with disabilities, a lot, including myself, I don't want to be back there and people bringing the communion to me. I really want to go and be there with everybody else because that's really what God really wants, I want to also talk about healing, if you don't, because that really, I think there is a lot of misunderstanding about healing when we think about faith communities, right? I think people generally have this idea that healing has to be magical. But really, I think Jesus really, if you go back to a lot of the stories and parables, you remember the story about the blind man that Jesus told. His disciples asked, who had sinned? And Jesus says, no one has sinned. This is so that, God will be glorified. And when I was young, I think from the moment I was diagnosed with polio until when I left Sierra Leone, I was always invited to crusades. And that was a welcoming thing. That's a great thing. The opportunity to go meet other Christians, the opportunity to fellowship and pray and connect with people. I love that. But what was challenging for me and very painful was when people would say, when they call all of us up there, and they pray for us, and then some of us come back and we're not able to walk the way people want us to walk. And then they say, well, Rodney, you have no faith. That's, and I think that's where the misunderstanding lies, because there is more to healing than just, the dropping of the crutches. I am a healing example, right? My life is all about healing, right? When you think about it. The fact that I barely escaped Sierra Leone during the war, I often think about this. What would have happened to me if I had stayed in Sierra Leone during that civil conflict? My father died there. God forbid that could have happened. Talking about healing miracle, I'm able to write and teach and do a lot of the things those teachers and that headmistress or those headmistresses thought I would never be able to do, right? And for me, that's a healing, my healing story. Yeah.
Beautiful. And I think healing is one of those areas when we think about theology that is subject to great misunderstanding. And part of when we talk about how God sees disability and how God sees people with disability is to try and correct theological misunderstandings and give people richer understandings to replace those misunderstandings, right?
Absolutely.
So what are some, and I put this to both of you, what are some of the key theological principles that underline for you this concept of the way God sees disability and the way God sees people with disability?
Well, Nancy Ireland, wrote The Disabled God. Phenomenal book. Some people might say that she was pushing it. but in so many ways, what she was really trying to say, it took Jesus to be broken, right? To go through the crucifixion. Jesus had a disability. Other people had to help him carry that cross, right? And so disability really, when you think about it from a theological perspective, it's saying to us that brokenness and vulnerability is what brings salvation. It's what really leads to healing, right? Without that brokenness, without the disability and the pain, there is no salvation.
So, if Jesus embodies what we're talking about, the brokenness that leads to our redemption and our wholeness. Joanne, what about for you? Kind of some key theological principles that for you have defined the way God sees disability and sees people with disability.
I definitely think of support and accommodation, and we all have a purpose in life, regardless of disability or impairment. And I think of the story of Moses, who had a speech impediment, and the Lord doesn't take away his speech impediment. He's still called to lead, and he has Aaron and Hur who kind of come and help with raising his hands. And I think that's a beautiful image of accommodation and support, and really that the image of the banquet, the great banquet in Luke, it's really about community and being together. And I think that teachings using a banquet and gathering and sharing a meal that just evokes a lot of feelings of joy and celebration and welcome and belonging. It's a word we talk about a lot. And so those concepts, both thinking about how all of us have gifts that we bring to the table. And when we think about individuals with disabilities, particularly thinking about their indispensability and their the gifts that they bring, just enriches our community experiences of each other and makes our lives, I think, more full and more whole. So
talk a little bit more about that term indispensable and where that comes from kind of in theology and scripture.
Yes, I think about just giftings, that we all have different gifts and functions within the body of Christ, and we all have different ways that the Lord uses us. But I think it's only in using us in our individual giftings in community and bringing us all together and creating that more holistic outpouring and revelation of our collective gifts. So,
yeah. Well, living in a society, and I think this is probably true of most societies in the world, that privileges wealth and power and status and attributes value to people who, sort of can display those kinds of things. We're confronted with a gospel of Jesus on the cross, pouring himself out and saying that the indispensable members of the body are the ones who are typically given the least attention. Yeah. It's dramatic. It's transformative. And when we think about the potential of churches to be places where those systems are turned upside down and the glory of God is displayed through our inclusion of every person, recognizing that their gifts are indispensable to our becoming who we are meant to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is amazing. That is an amazing vision. And yet it's been hard to actualize. And part of what we're talking about is how do we equip faith communities and schools as well to be the kinds of places that aren't just extending charity or being nice to people with disabilities, but recognizing them as essential.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's giving you hope? Because I know it's been a long fight in a way to help open doors. So when you look at church or theological settings, do you see things right now that are causing you to be hopeful that we're making progress?
Well, yes, Jeff, definitely. I think a lot of churches are more open to inclusion, right? And I see at least some of the churches that I have been involved with, even here in California, being willing to have forums, right, or educate people about disabilities and then make more things accessible, right? And so that definitely brings hope. But like you said earlier, the challenge is people are so often set in their ways, right? And we live in a society that has idolized normality and perfection, right? For so long. And trying to break that is what one of the biggest challenges.
Yes.
Right? That what is normal, Who is really normal?
Yes.
I mean, if even you were to take a human being who you would say is the perfect person, right? Just our behavior, right? I mean, things can change. 1 minute we're upset. 1 minute we're happy. The next moment, something is going wrong. And so everybody deals with their own challenges of brokenness or issues in their life. There is no perfection. There is no normality. And if we can, right, begin to, counter that and help people to understand and see, hopefully with more of these kinds of programs and with continued education, with advocacy, with more people with disabilities, right? Inclusion is opening the door.
Yes.
It's nice that we open the door, but belonging is where we now need to move. So the churches are opening the door, but they need to bring people in and have these people lead activities, become the priests, take charge of several issues in the church and see their gifts at work. Yes. When once that begins to open, then I think we would have arrived, in the place where we need to be.
The beauty of what I hear you saying, what resonates so strongly is this illusion of perfection that so many of us are driven to try to achieve is a kind of bondage. And in the drive to be that image of normality or perfection, we are closed in because we can't let people see who we really are or what really is going on. And when that is broken, we're actually free to get the thing that we really are wanting, which is love, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the church can be the place where we can be free from the necessity or the demands of perfectionism and become the vulnerable community in which all are welcome. And Joanne, to your image of the banquet, where we're all invited to be at the table together. What about, Joanne, hopeful signs? What are you seeing that caused you to be hopeful?
I would just pick up on the idea of people with disabilities being involved in the church more, not just thinking about, I think that shift from we're here to serve to the disability community versus we're here to serve with the disability community. So opportunities, more presence, involvement of individual adults, kids with disabilities. I actually, the Champions Club model, one of their core values, which is a special needs ministry model, but one of their core values, I think, really just says it all, is we don't turn anyone away. Mm-hmm. And I think if churches can just start by not turning anyone away, that would be a huge first step. Yeah. There's a lot to unpack behind that value and actually bring it to fruition in like a tangible, real sense. But I think the mindset, the heart that's represented from, not turning anyone away, because we really should be modeling inclusion. If we can't model it in the church, I think.
Where else will it work?
Where else is it going to be modeled?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Well, this has been so rich, you guys, and we're kind of winding down toward the end of our conversation. But I'm wondering if there is somebody who's listening or watching who thinks, I really want to be involved in contributing to communities that are more welcoming and inclusive and empowering. And this could be a person with a disability or somebody who is without a disability, but maybe is a teacher or a community member. What kind of recommendations would you make to somebody who's stirred, they're inspired, they want to be part of making more inclusive communities? What might they do?
I think of Joni and Friends and Joni X in Tada. Talk about a woman who has gone through so much, but really understands the model of using your suffering and your pain for God's glory, right? And that is a website that I would encourage people to go to, and if you're a church and you're interested in opening up your church, they've got all kinds of programs, and trainings, they would even come out, to help you with those things. So you start there. And then I also think of the Center for Exceptional Children with a website as well that has a lot of resources, particularly for educators, right? And they do a lot of advocacy work and, things that would help change policies and the plight that were involved. So those two resources I would definitely love to, offer, my listeners.
I love it. Yeah. Joanne?
I would add, if there is that stirring in a listener right now, I think just taking that first step and connecting with your local church and kind of making it known that this is something that you care about, that you'd like to see grow or develop in your church community. I think that's, it's church ministry, and doing work like this, I think, takes, a collective effort. So it can't just be one person. And so knowing that, if you're involved with your church and someone on your church staff knows that you have this heart, I think, you can easily get involved. I think there's always opportunity and room for growth, even if you happen to attend a church that has an established ministry. So
I love that. I love that. Rodney.
I talked about radical love, if you all recall, the session we had here in the summer. So I also want to end with that, because when you think, one of the things that brought me to the study of resilience was really about people who are profoundly disabled. So I was sitting at one of the Chapman classes, in one of my theoretical courses, and we were talking about theories we could possibly use. And I started thinking about people who were profoundly disabled, and Stephen Hawkins really came to mind, and what resilience looks like, in somebody who, needs a lot of help from caretakers and all of that, especially when we think about resilience from a psychological perspective. It's often so much about the medical model, right? And I realized that interdependence really is key when we talk about disability. And this whole idea about radical love, to me, I want people to understand that regardless of how profoundly disabled somebody is, right, they're still made in the image of God, right? Somebody may not be able to walk or talk or move their hands, or maybe just is only able to move a little finger, but you will be shocked and surprised what's going on within their spirit. There's a lot going on in there, right? And so be open, right? Be open to love people and just see what people will offer you. And you look at Stephen Hawkins' life. I mean, a man so profoundly disabled, but look at all what he has contributed to the educational community.
Beautiful. The radical love of God can turn into radical love for us, for each other. A beautiful way to end the conversation. Dr. Rodney Hume-Dawson, Dr. Joanne Van Boxtel, thank you so much for joining us today for Education for Love and Wisdom.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Wow, Jeff, that was an incredible conversation. The insights, the personal stories touched my heart listening to them. I know for you, that must have been really meaningful. And of course, hearing our colleague, Dr. Joanne Van Boxtel, talk about what she's so passionate about anytime is very impressive. Dr. Rodney Hume-Dawson really has such a wonderful perspective from his own life, and I appreciate the way that came out in this episode. Very meaningful, very rich, and deep, I would say, episode this time around.
Nathan, it may be that some of our listeners or viewers would be interested in engaging further in the conversation. How could they do that?
Well, to you listening online, whether you're checking this out on a website like YouTube or perhaps listening to this episode, I'd encourage you to stay in touch with us. We are the Education for Love and Wisdom podcast. We are supported here by Vanguard University. We have Dr. Jeff Hittenberger, who is our gracious host. He's also the Dean of the School of Education, and I'm here as the technical support and co-producer, Dr. Nathan Braze. We would be happy and thrilled to connect with you. If you have any questions related to perhaps a career in education, or you just like to connect with us, like to leave us a comment, or you have some questions for us, we'd love to connect with you. You can email us at loveandwisdom@vanguard.edu. And you can also check out our website, which is connected to the Vanguard University website. That is vanguard.edu/love and wisdom. We'd love to hear from you, and thanks for joining our episode.